We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm honored today to be joined by Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. And I want to talk about trade. I want to talk about a lot of things, but trade is the main thing because you've got such a history with trade policy in the United States. And it's certainly something that I think the Republican Party wrestles with, as far as where our principles lie here. We know we're in favor of free market principles, but, there's an obvious question. Does that apply internationally? Is it always good? Are there never trade-offs? And of course, from Ohio, there's that's of course the discussion. So I want to get into that and your history, but first I want to tell the audience a little bit about you and why I asked you to talk about this subject. So Senator Portman began his public service 3 decades ago in 3 presidential administrations, 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, 6 terms in the House, distinguishing visiting fellow in the practice of public policy at AEI. And just to be clear, in the George W. Bush administration, his cabinet position was a director of the Office of Management and Budget. That's a pretty huge position. And U.S. Trade Representative, another huge position. He's been the Associate Counsel to the President and Director, White House Office of Legislative Affairs under President George H.W. Bush. He's had more than 220 bills signed into law between Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Barack Obama. Pretty impressive. Okay. So we want to talk, I don't even know where to begin here. Maybe with a little bit of how your career started. You started as a lawyer, then into legislative affairs for the White House. Yeah. How did that lead into director of, was that the next thing, director of OMB?
Then I was in the House, and between the House and the Senate, I went over to the George W. Bush administration. So a couple Texans. Yeah. So Houstonian.
Very solid understanding of the budget process, how it works. I mean, there's a million tangents I think we could go down here. But let's focus on trade. I think it's important to start with some history. You seem like the kind of person who might be good to ask those sort of questions. I mean, since the founding, how is our government, our country, perceived trade with other countries, and how has it changed over time? I remember taking a class in my undergrad, and I remember learning about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs.
Yeah.
Okay, I forgot what those even are. Maybe and why those are important for our current discussions on trade. But if somebody asked you, what's the history of trade here and trade policy and how it's changed over time, how would you answer?
Well, first, it's been controversial. So it's kind of been up and down in terms of the acceptance of trade. But let me say first, I really appreciate your asking me to come on today, and I admired your work, both from a Senate perspective when I was in the Senate until about a year and 3 months ago. And since I got out, I chose not to run again. I'm glad to be out, but I'm also glad that some good people chosen to stay in. So thank you for your service, your service in the military, your service here, and your willingness to take on these tough issues like trade, because it's important to talk about it. I think, Dan, the basic issue with trade is, if you're a free trade person, for unfettered free trade, you're probably being insensitive to the realities for a lot of people who get affected negatively by trade, who believe it's unfair when other countries are cheating, when they're selling it below their cost, which is called dumping, or when they are subsidizing it. So yes, I think I'm not an unfettered free trade person for that reason. On the other hand, if you're a protectionist, you have to answer the economic question. Why would you want to hurt the economy and hurt the ability to have trade between different countries? Because some countries make some things better than another. Some countries make things we don't make here. So you want to bring them in, including, some agricultural products where, they only make them someplace else. So I think there's a great middle here, which is what I call balanced trade, where you are sensitive to countries that cheat and you make them pay for that. In other words, you put tariffs on, you enforce the laws. And I wouldn't think some new laws are necessary for some of the stuff that China is doing, because they transship stuff to another country and then bring it in so it's not subject to the China tariffs. And we have to follow that and be sure that it's being done fairly. So that's always been the big issue. Smoot-Hawley tariffs was, something we Republicans probably are not too proud of because a lot of people thought it was contributing to the Great Depression. Because when you don't trade, particularly as a country that wasn't as developed as we were then, you really hurt the economy.
That's right. So the history of that was the Great Depression was happening, and the idea was, hey, we need to protect local industries here. So we put these massive tariffs on any imports. And what was the result of that?
It's taxes, so it meant higher inflation, higher costs for Americans, and that's one thing we have to realize, that tariffs are taxes, in my view. I mean, some people disagree with that, and Ronald Reagan famously said, if you want less of something, tax it. If you want more of something, subsidize it. And so other countries subsidize, we tax, and then you end up with less of something. But I do think that the key is to enforce the trade laws that are in place. And I would even add additional trade laws, again, to deal with some of these extraordinary circumstances like China, and be sure that people understand that, this is about a level playing field. And if you tell people that, I find, at least in Ohio, which is one of the states that's been most affected negatively by some of the trade practices of the last 30 years, that people get it and they're willing to compete as long as it's viewed as a level playing field. Again, an absolute level playing field, hard to say. What do you take into account? Environmental and labor issues and carbon footprint and all that stuff. But bottom line is, if you require countries to not sell it below their costs, not to subsidize, not to bend the rules on trade, then we can compete. And by the way, we can win. We're lucky in this country because we have some of the greatest universities in the world. We got some of the greatest research. We got some of the greatest workers. We're more productive than most countries. We're kind of the cleanest dirty shirt in the closet right now in terms of our economy. AI, we're way ahead on that. And its implementation in the manufacturing sector, for example, is really exciting. So I think we can compete and win, but we have to be sure that these other countries aren't cheating.
Yeah. And a common refrain is, well, all our manufacturing jobs in Ohio got shipped to China. So that's a bumper sticker slogan, really. But what's the nuanced view of that statement?
Well, jobs are coming back now, one. So Ohio is remanufacturing itself, into a manufacturing center again. And that's really exciting. There was an announcement made today, which is an extreme example because this is an American subsidization of something we consider strategic, which is semiconductors. But, we went from a point of having developed all the technology for semiconductors, having about 38% of the market 30 years ago, to today we're down to 12%.
Right.
And the high-end stuff is all made.
Because we didn't promote one guy at Texas Instruments, and then he went on to found TSMC.
Yeah.
It's like I learned that story, and I was like, damn.
And that's it in Texas. And for people watching, TSMC in Taiwan in general, maybe not all TSMC, most of them, they make 90% of the high-end chips now. And we need them for everything from F-150s to F-35s.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that we have that industry. So today there was an announcement made that, we're going to help keep that here. And that results in about 3,000 jobs in Ohio, high-end jobs, and about 5,000 or 7,000, between 5,000 and 7,000 construction jobs to build this new fab, they call it, in central Ohio. So I think there's a balance here where we subsidize what is really important to us strategically and make sure that we don't lose it and it doesn't go offshore. But then in general, we enforce the trade laws more rigorously and put some other laws in place to be sure other countries are not playing by the rules.
But you can't make policy without understanding the past policy mistakes. And so, going back to this, we shipped all our jobs to China. I mean, there is, of course, some truth to that, right? There's entire towns that were just upended because the industries went out of business. And maybe each individual situation is different. I don't know. It could have been automation. It could have been a number of factors. But in some cases, it certainly could be Chinese dumping, Chinese subsidies that just overwhelm an industry, and we let it happen. And so looking back in time, when did this really start to happen? And what were the policy mistakes? Or I guess, policy oversights. I don't know, that, the things we didn't do that we maybe should have done in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I think you put your finger on it, which is it's a combination of technology and trade. Most economists who look at it dispassionately think probably technology is the biggest part of this, is that there are fewer jobs in manufacturing today because we make a lot more stuff with a lot fewer people,
Right.
thanks to automation and other technologies. And automation is not a bad thing, but we have to recognize that it takes away jobs. AI, same thing. Most people argue that AI ultimately will create more jobs, software engineers and so on. But it does, result in some displacement of some jobs. So, yeah, I think I said 30 years ago earlier, probably about 30 years ago. And, it was America kind of joining the global economy, more globalization. And you're right. I mean, some of these countries, like China, did not play by the rules. They were communist countries.
We didn't make them. We didn't even try to make them.
We did.
We were under this foolish naivete that they were just going to, evolve into the democratic, wonderful trading partner that we wanted them to. Yeah. Meanwhile, they had other plans. So now everybody knows this now. There's plenty of literature on this, that they were planning this the whole time and that we were just too stupid to realize it.
And we also thought that, like every other country in the world, as they developed, they would become a market economy. Their political system would become a so-called liberal political system, meaning, a real democracy. And it didn't happen. It's not
like a mercantilist, corporatist sort of.
Yeah, totally.
I'm not sure if
we thought if they were watching, Fox News and CNN, that they would become like us, but that didn't happen. They're watching too much MSNBC.
Yeah, that's probably right. Or American Horror Story or whatever the hell they're watching.
But that was, naive of us. Now, what the economists will say, the pure free trade economists, is yes, some manufacturing moved to China, some because the technology just shrunk, and that moved to China came back to our shores with a less expensive product, so that was good for our consumers. So overall, the impact on the economy was positive.
And the problem with that, go ahead.
Well, it doesn't deal with the strategic importance that we saw in COVID to have a good supply chain of
basic stuff.
Of stuff we just have to have, one. And two, I think it's insensitive to the workforce to say, that's fine. You welders and machinists are going to all lose your jobs because we can get it cheaper.
Yeah, but everybody will get their plastic mugs for 3 cents cheaper.
Yeah.
So, you're lucky. Be lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the only thing I was going to add is agreeing with you that's the libertarian utopia. And this is why I don't consider myself libertarian. I think it's a fine market theory. I don't think it works as a political philosophy because it's utopianistic, and it imagines this world that honestly doesn't exist. And I feel the same way about liberals. They're utopianistic. They're not held by true foundational principles. And I think actually libertarians are. I just think it's like very narrow principles, that just refuse to acknowledge the reality of international trade, how other countries work, how that playing field is not level, and also how devastating it is to society. And they're just thinking about economics. So they're thinking, well, I do the math, and in the aggregate, this is a net benefit. Okay, therefore it is good. But that's not true, because when an entire town gets destroyed and addicted to opiates, like that's not good. And like, I would pay more for my stupid plastic mugs.
Exactly.
If it saved a bunch of lives.
And I think those of us who believe that, and I mentioned balanced trade earlier, because I don't consider myself an unfettered free trader or a protectionist, but this balanced trade idea where you enforce the laws and you be sure that you have right laws in place to make sure it's fair, costs will be a little higher than they would be in a totally unfettered free market. But you're retaining one strategic national security goods that you want to produce here. But second, there's this whole cultural issue, and how do you keep the country together? And
there's a fabric that has to be at least acknowledged, and especially for goods that are things we need. I think we need to be able to build airplanes and ships. So I'm a Jones Act guy because I'm from the Gulf Coast, so I should be a Jones Act guy. But boy, that gets hammered by the right wing libertarian types because look, and they make their argument is not wrong. Their argument is not wrong at all. It increases the cost of goods. But my thing is, without it, you will not have a maritime industry, and that's a real problem. I mean, it's a national security problem. You need food, so we do the Farm Bill every 5 years. And does it feel gross a little bit to like a free market conservative? A little bit, yeah. But the alternative is a lot bit worse. And you keep going down the list, and
I got into this quite a bit with semiconductor because I was one of the people pushing for this idea of the CHIPS Act. And again, economic point of view, I totally understood my colleagues who opposed it and why they opposed it. But ultimately, you have to be able to produce the chips here, we found out. Otherwise, you had I mentioned F-150s before, you had the F-150s on the parking lots, just thousands of them because they couldn't get a chip. And more importantly, for our military, we just have to have the ability to produce these high-end chips for our warfighters. So I think there's a balance here. The other reality, which is the point I made repeatedly in this debate, is that these other countries around the world, China, debate Republicans who are more free market saying you can't build semiconductor companies, is that these other countries around the world that we're competing with, all of them subsidize heavily. In fact, more heavily than we do, even now with the CHIPS Act. And so South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, they heavily subsidize it because they understand the importance of having semiconductors,
right? And
the leverage that it gives them. So, we're not living in a perfect world where everybody plays by the rules,
right? And there's trade-offs. I mean, you subsidize an industry, and maybe they get too comfortable. They don't feel they need to compete, and maybe that's the story of Boeing 737s at the moment. But I acknowledge the trade-offs. Again, we don't live in a perfect world. The alternative of just not having an industry is pretty unacceptable. What's your take on the World Trade Organization? And so maybe give us a quick snapshot of it. What does it even do? Yeah, give us WTO 101 and how it plays out for America.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those organizations that was set up sort of in the post-World War II new order where you're going to have trade between countries and they would be kind of a referee. And not a bad concept, but unfortunately it has evolved into something that is unfair to the United States in certain regards. I think over the last 20 years, let's say that's the appellate level where the appellate bodies make decisions about trade disputes. And two, it's fallen apart because countries aren't using it to negotiate. The Doha Agreement, which was supposed to be the new multilateral agreement under the WTO that would lower tariffs all around the world for everybody, which would have been a good thing in economic theory and in practice, it could have been good to the United States, never came together. And the other thing about the WTO is that it works by consensus, meaning that you got to have all the countries on board. Now that sounds good, but when you have countries like China who have a voice in this, they will never go along with something that's really a market economy, more of a free trade approach. They take the non-market economy approach where they're allowed to subsidize and so on. So that they have not played by the rules of WTO. You're not supposed to do what they do, and yet they block a lot of things. So my view, for what it's worth, is that WTO should get back to an organization that can function and that can deal with trade negotiations by saying that you don't have to have everybody on board. It doesn't have to be a consensus. If you have, say, 2/3 of the world agreeing on...
Is that how it works now? So it literally has to be unanimous?
That's be unanimous. The one exception, I think, was the government procurement agreement, which was done by what's called a plurilateral, meaning, a majority, and that worked. So what we need to do, I think, is to get back to that, where countries of like-minded countries can come together and put together agreements, and then those that don't support that can't hitchhike on it. They can't piggyback on the benefits of it. There have to be consequences. So I think the organization needs a total revamp.
How would you do that?
Well, the United States has some allies to do that, which is EU, Japan, Australia, the more free market-oriented economies in the world. And we get together and say, we're going to set up an organization or do it within the WTO.
Yeah. What's some, let's talk about myths of trade policy. I mean, trade deficits come to mind. What's your take on trade deficits when people say, we have this big trade deficit with China, they're eating our lunch? Does that matter to us?
Well, again, it depends. If it's because of a distortion, that's bad and you don't want it. But where we've had some of the largest trade deficits is when we've had some of our strongest economic conditions here in this country. Why? Because, we're buying a lot of stuff and we can't get it here, so we buy it overseas. But in general, I think it's a relevant factor. I think we ought to consider it. I think when we do a trade agreement with another country, we ought to consider that. I will say trade agreements get a bum rap because they're not the problem. China, there's no trade agreement.
Mm.
You know, Japan, India, no trade agreement. EU, no trade agreement. We have trade agreements with about 20 countries, and we send half of our exports to those countries, which comprise 10% of the world economy.
Mm.
Only 10% of the world economy takes half of our exports.
Hmm.
And that's because we have a trade agreement. What a trade agreement does, it knocks down barriers so that we can sell our wheat and our corn and our rice and our manufactured products, our services. And the other country, at least under the agreement, if they do it, they have we have some enforcement opportunities, to force them to do it. So generally speaking, trade agreements are good for us. That's where we send most of, or half of our exports, where we have a trade agreement. This Biden administration approach to stop all trade agreements, which they've not done a single one. Remember, Donald Trump did a great trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, our two largest trading partners. He got about 4/5 of the way there on one with the UK that should have been finished. But the Biden administration, I guess, made a commitment during the campaign not to do any trade agreements, and kind of shot ourselves in the foot, because other countries are just massively, engaging with other countries. Like China's done a bunch of trade agreements. The EU's done a bunch. We're sort of sitting still here. We lose out on the benefits. So let's say the EU does a trade agreement, with South Korea. Because we don't have a trade agreement with the EU, we lose out on the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So they get the benefit, and
Biden's?
They can beat us in the market.
What's their reasoning?
Well, I think it's just politically hard for Democrats to support trade agreements, because
Labor unions are just always against trade agreements.
unions are usually against trade. Yeah. Now, not all unions are, but the majority are. And they had a powerful voice, I think, in the administration. But it's too bad, because we've missed out on a bunch of opportunities. And countries want to deal with us. They would much rather deal with us than with China. They really would.
Yeah. What do you, on that question, I mean, are you optimistic about the future? It seems that without any policy from our end, that the private sector is losing faith in doing business in China and starting to, at least diversify their supply chains and manufacturing. Ideally, we'd want to see a lot of that come to Mexico, central, nearshoring. Do you see that happening? And what could we do from this body to actually make it happen? Or is that really a presidential prerogative to actually engage in some trade talk?
No, I think this body could do more. There's a bill called Level the Playing Field that I got passed with a Democrat about, 6 or 7 years ago. We have a new one. It's not passed yet, Level the Playing Field 2.0.
Yeah.
And it gets at what China does, particularly in their Belt and Road countries. So they have relationships with countries around the world where they supply, help on infrastructure and so on, usually loans. And what they do is sometimes they build a factory there, and it's all Chinese money. It's all Chinese backed, sometimes Chinese workers even. And that's how they get around the tariffs that are put on the Chinese company.
Yeah.
And our laws don't cover that. So
Right.
we've got to change our laws, in my view. So that's one thing we could do from Congress. But you're right, the market's kind of adjusting on its own, and we are de-risking, as people say, from China, not decoupling altogether, but de-risking, which I think is a good thing for us as a country, because we're moving manufacturing, as an example, out of China into countries that are more friendly. They call it friend sourcing, or we should say to Mexico or the United States. So actually moving into the United States. And I think that's a good development, and it's happening naturally. It does mean the costs are a little higher, but I think our national security has improved substantially. And again, we saw this in COVID. When you can't get, masks and gloves and other, PPE, because China has a quarter on the market during COVID, it kind of gets your attention.
Yeah.
Same with some drugs, but there are lots of other products too. I think we should delineate between strategic products like that,
Right.
and non-strategic products. So toys from China.
Really, without some toys for a while, we can make our own toys.
Yeah.
That kind of leads into my next question, which is, what industry or product are we missing from that strategic list that we should really be focused on? We did the CHIPS Act. It was controversial. I actually voted against it, but only because I preferred Kevin Brady's approach, which was, just basically a massive tax credit. My understanding from the chip manufacturers was that was what they were excited about anyway. In any case, it's somewhat controversial, I'll say. It's not like all this other stuff. But what else? I mean, so we did that. What else are we missing here?
Well, I think any dual-use technology, period. So if it can be used for commercial and military. We need to tighten the standards of, what that definition is. And that has to do with export controls so that we aren't allowed to send technology to China that could be used. So people would say, well, gosh, this is just for manufacturing that we're supplying this, this IP, this intellectual property or whatever it is. But if it could also be used on the military side, I think that's one place where Congress can and should act to tighten that up. But there's a growing skepticism about China in general. President Trump talked about it in connection with cars being built in Mexico, the plan for Chinese car companies to set up factories in Mexico, build cars, and then ship them to the United States. As a free trader, you would think, why should we stop that? That's good. That's, car companies have to compete. American car companies have to compete. One problem with that is the way the Biden administration has proceeded with these unions and with, electric vehicles and so on. Our car companies are in trouble right now. They're not able to compete fairly. But second is,
that's a good thing to point out is a lot of this is self-imposed.
It's self-imposed
regulations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other issue is if the cars are made in Mexico, but with a Chinese company, Chinese technology, maybe even Chinese workers, because that's often the way it happens. I think there's an issue there that we need to look at that, because of the technology. This sounds kind of like sci-fi or something, but if the technology could be used to collect data, or even a radar system, and apparently some of these cars have, to be able to look inside of a military installation, that's an issue. So we got to be sure that that's covered. Whatever was
Speaking of collecting data, how do you think the TikTok bill fares in the Senate?
Well, I don't know. I'm not there, but my sense is from talking to colleagues that they want to take their time and look at it more carefully. I have a real issue with TikTok because they could never answer the question as to whether the Chinese nationals had access to the data. And when they were forced to answer it, they had to say yes.
Of course they do.
So
we knew it anyway. I don't ask questions I don't know the answer to already.
Yeah.
And
that's the problem, is that so you have the Chinese Communist Party having access to this data. And so I think what the House did is it's necessary to sever that.
It was well thought out. It wasn't well socialized. I mean, I'm on the committee. I barely got it side of the bill. It's a good bill, though. There was a lot of work went into that. A lot of background research and talking to the right people. And I think it just, you got to thread a needle with this. And I think it threads it. I was pretty surprised about the backlash. I didn't realize Tucker Carlson was taking so much money from the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not sure what the explanation is otherwise for his sudden 180 on it. I don't like Tucker Carlson, if that's not really obvious. Well, I hope it passes the Senate, because my problem isn't so much data. Because look, you talk to any teenager, they don't give a damn if you take their data. They're like, I don't care. I like TikTok. What do I care about my data?
Yeah.
I'm running my small business. I don't care about my data. The problem is the ability to use it as a propaganda machine. And they're absolutely willing to do that. In our limited time left, I want to talk about the differences between the House and the Senate, which you happen to know pretty well. So somebody asked you, I mean, I could ask a bunch of specific questions, but let's just go general. What's the difference? How do they go culturally and the rules and, what's it like?
Yeah. Well, the House is more fun.
Yeah. It's a little more lively.
It's a little more lively. And I had a lot of great friends in the House. And I have friends in the Senate, but it's more collegial in the Senate. Mm-hmm. People get along better. Democrats and Republicans work together.
Only 100 of you probably actually know everybody's names.
So,
I can't learn everybody's name.
Yeah, you get to know everybody. And it's 6 years. That may be the biggest difference. It's 6 years rather than 2 years. So once you get reelected, you have what they call the 6-year smile. It's like, I can relax for a few years.
Yeah.
In the old days, you didn't raise money until like the 5th year. Now that's not true. You probably start raising money right away. But you don't have much pressure on you. And, because it is a 6-year term, there's a little less political pressure on people.
Right. It's one of the only things that allows it to be like that, and to make necessary tough deals, tough votes. And so it's harder to do here.
Yeah. And then the other big difference is the filibuster. And I support the filibuster because I fear that if Democrats got rid of it, which of course they would have except for two people, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, that they would put through some really bad legislation when they have the House and the Senate and the presidency, which they did. So they don't now because the House is Republican, barely, but that could happen again. And some Republicans say, well, what if we got all three, the House, the Senate, and the White House? Wouldn't you be for it then? And I say, no, because to me, it's a principle that for our country, if you have 60 vote margin rather than 51 vote margin, you're going to more likely end up with legislation that has some sustainability.
Right.
Otherwise, you're doing like tax policy, healthcare policy, just go back and forth, back and forth.
And by definition, I think that turns us into the pure democracy that our founders are so scared of.
Yeah.
Because that's just the nature of our current politics. We are a 50-50 nation. And because of the way districts are drawn now in the House, we are always going to have a slim majority, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And then the Senate is similar, right? It's just the way the map is right now.
Yeah.
And so then you'll have two bodies that are basically 51-49 and a president that was elected on a 51-49 basis. And so you do have pure democracy at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's never what our founders wanted. That was never what they wanted, for good reason, because that quickly turns into some anarchy and mob rule.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's important. And I think people up here sometimes forget the institutions have to be more important than your policy platform. They really do, especially as a conservative, since part of policy platform is indeed the institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. As a conservative, I think the institutional conservatism of the Senate is something to protect, because otherwise you're going to have wild swings back and forth. And it's bad for our economy. It's bad for families, who are trying to figure out what the rules are. And I think it's just, as you say, it leads to some really potentially damaging effects. Let's take, for example, court packing, which has been talked about by the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take, for example, D.C. statehood and Puerto Rican statehood, which when you took to reverse. I mean, people just think about that.
Right. Yeah. It's like, well, even if you let them have it, just so we can take it 2 years from now, it's hard to reverse some things, as you point out. What about the way you vote? You don't vote like we do.
Oh, yeah. And
that matters quite a bit for how legislation gets passed.
It's like old school. You walk up and kind of mosey up, and then you raise your hand for a yes or.
So how long does a typical vote take?
Forever.
And so the reason that's important for how policy and legislation gets passed is because we pass a ton of stuff out of the House.
Yeah.
And we're always wondering, where does it go?
Yeah.
It does, because even these suspension bills that we all agree on, like, why wouldn't they just pass the Senate?
Yeah.
And I guess I remind people, well, because it takes them 6 hours or whatever to vote on anything, where it takes us 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And so how do you guys do that? At least for suspension bills, and just for the audience, suspension bills just mean we vote on them quickly because, they have massive support. And so how do you guys just put them all together?
Yeah, we have nothing like that. So in the House with a 2/3 vote, you can pass something quickly without going through a rules process and so on. In the Senate, the only thing you do is unanimous consent. And almost always somebody objects. Even if they aren't sure they have a problem with it, they object just to find out if they have a problem with it. And so things get stuck. But in general, any senator can require that you get 60 votes. And you go through a process of getting cloture, and then, having a vote on the cloture, and then a vote on the bill, and then blah, blah, blah. So it can take, 2 weeks to pass a bill, maybe 3 weeks. Unless it's, really popular, then it can be done quickly.
Well, like, what do you guys actually do with all our suspensions? I mean, can you package them all together
Typically,
and then go through that process?
We often will put them under unanimous consent. So you do a search basically of the Democrat cloakroom, the Republican cloakroom, and you find out if anybody has any objections to it. And I don't know what the percentage is, maybe 25, 30% of the time, no one has an objection.
Mm-hmm.
But if they do, they look at it for a couple of days. Some of our more conservative members object to everything just to be sure there's not something in there that they don't like. But probably a lot of them do get passed in the dark of the night, and it's just a unanimous consent. And so,
I've always been curious, like, what the actual percentage is of stuff we vote on, where it goes. But
then others get caught up in bigger bills. We don't pass that many bills because it's so hard to pass them. You got to, the vote is usually a couple weeks to the Senate floor just to pass something. So things get bundled up. The appropriations process is a total disaster in the House and the Senate, but maybe particularly the Senate, because we bundle a lot of stuff into it that's not appropriations even, to get them through, because it's the only vehicle you have sometimes.
I explain that to people about the budget. People get mad about an omnibus, everything packaged together. And I'm like, look, I don't like it either, but I'm also not sure how else it's ever going to get done because you got 12 appropriations bills, and for some reason we think that's some sort of this it's sacred, right? These 12, and I'm like, why? We made that up in like the 70s. It's not in the Constitution. It doesn't have to be 12, but so sure there are, and then you got to make deals in order for one side to agree to the other one, and then vice versa, and so it ends up in one big package. Tell me a better system, and we will go for it. But I'm not sure there is. I think the budget's just always going to be messy.
Yeah, I mean, a better system would be requiring that you do the bills, or else there's some penalty. And the penalty I like is that you reduce the spending by 1% the first 3 months, 1% the second 3 months. Have some consequence.
Right.
And I think that might get people's attention. The appropriators don't like that because they like kind of the back and forth and the horse trading sometimes. But I think you got to have some parameters and some consequences, and require people to do these bills. I mean, the one that bothers me the most, and I'm sure the same is true with you, is the Defense Department's bill, because when you do a continuing resolution, which just means you continue the spending from last year while you're trying to figure it out, or you do an omnibus that undercuts defense because you have to do the horse trading, it's just terrible for our planning. And right now we need a bunch of new starts because we need to have things that are technologically, better than the Chinese say. So we want to have a qualitative advantage,
right? And
not to have a bill means you don't get that. If you do the spending from last year, you don't get the new start on the brand new technology you need to fund and implement. So I think that's a real danger for us right now as a country, because China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, they're all watching this.
Right.
And they're seeing that America can't move as quickly as they can. And our ability to project force is what keeps the peace, I think.
Yeah, and then their inability to set up those new contracts because of the lack, it's a huge problem for our readiness. And it was proposed here out of the House that we would just do a year-long CR because it would result in spending cuts. I'm like, that will kill our national security. Yeah. They have no idea how bad that is. And some members just don't care, I guess. But it's a huge problem. I don't know. That's a longer conversation about budgeting, and be the guy to talk to because as director of OMB. But I feel like it's time for some creative solutions on that, because does it even make sense that we do it annually?
No.
I mean, with such an absurdly complex government.
Yeah. Biennial would help.
Yeah.
Just to have a year to do the kind of research you need to do to see what's working, what's not working, then a year to pass it.
Right.
Right now, it's kind of all squished together, and there's not really effective oversight, in my view, of the spending.
No, and it's impossible for any one member to even know. I mean, it's we do this as a team effort, and that's why we have different committees and different people focused on different areas of spending. But there is nobody, except maybe the OMB, who could name every single office and agency and department that gets a budget.
Not even OMB.
Yeah, nobody. It's complex, and people talk about zero-based budgeting. Okay, so you kind of start over every single time, but that's not realistic. That's not the education that is required to understand. Well, why do they need $30 million?
Yeah. Or
why are you suggesting a $30 million cut? Like there's never an explanation when those amendments come in, and so I'm like, how am I supposed to know what this? I mean, that one office alone probably takes weeks of research just to understand how it got to the point where it is and how you would change it to make it better. And I think there's a little bit of just this sort of irresponsible hand waving up here sometimes, because this gets to another bigger question of do you really feel responsible for your vote? And I'd like to think in the Senate they do more. But in the House, I think a lot of people just don't even feel responsible for their vote. It's more of a virtue signal than anything else.
And it tends to be more shorts and skins. So you vote with the Republicans or you vote with the Democrats.
There's a lot of that.
And explaining it is not required.
No. No. You vote no, you never have to explain anything. Yeah. Because you always find something wrong. Yeah. It's the easiest vote in the world to take. Did you prefer the Senate or the House?
Well, I said the House is more fun, honestly. But the Senate, one senator can make a bigger difference, and you can get more stuff done. As you know, I was very focused on working on things that I thought were important, the opioid crisis. Did a lot on the tax bill that I couldn't have done probably as a House member, and was the one who negotiated with Kevin Brady on the final parts of that tax bill. So you can get more done. Infrastructure bill, I felt strongly about. I think that was important to get done. Wasn't perfect, but it was necessary for our country and our competitiveness, our economy. So I think the Senate probably is a little better place to get stuff done. The most fun job, though, was U.S. trade rep, because I got to represent the greatest country.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I've got to go, or he's got it. Both. Okay, one last question. So, because the question I wanted to ask on the U.S. trade rep is how those meetings go. We see these big publicized meetings between presidents and leaders of countries, and how substantive are their conversations ever? Are they just scripted? Like, how does that work? I mean, the trade reps do the real work.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the big G7 meetings and that sort of stuff with the heads of state, some of that is scripted and they don't know the details. But I will say, with regard to trade, first of all, it was a huge honor to represent America, seriously, because when we do a trade agreement, like, we insist that the markets be reformed and, all the things that we believe helps make a country and make people successful and prosperous. We push those agenda items and people respect the United States still in terms of our position in the world on trade. There's this IPEF thing that the Biden administration is doing over in Asia, which is not effective in my view. There's no market access. It's just kind of called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But you know what? Every country in the region has joined because they want to talk with us.
Right.
They'd rather work with us than China.
Was it a big mistake? Was it the FTT? T16.
Trans-Pacific Partnerships.
The TPP.
I mean, it would make sense to do something like that.
I had all the wrong letters.
Because we already have an agreement with most of those countries. We have one with Singapore, we have one with Australia. If we have one with Japan, that would really, really tilt. So anyway, so those meetings, I was proud to represent America. But when you're across from the negotiator from another country, they know their stuff. Because think about it, trade is so much more important to a smaller country. We got a big market right here. Yeah. But if you're a Singapore, let's say, which is a tiny country with a huge trade agenda, or even New Zealand, you really put kind of your best and brightest in the trade job, and they tend to be added for a while. We tend to, our trade reps tend to come and go. Yeah. So it was tough sometimes because these people knew their stuff. I'm not saying the heads of state knew the details, but the trade ministers, the negotiators were pretty impressive. That
didn't surprise me at all. They're usually U.S. educated, and like, what's their main focus is knowing about the U.S. What's our main focus? Kind of knowing everything. So it's a bit of a
and trade is their lifeblood,
Right.
So they take it more seriously than we do sometimes.
What was your biggest win as a trade rep?
Well, I was able to take China to the WTO at that time WTO was working for the first time ever on a trade case and win ultimately. That was good. And
to be clear, to win, you have to get how do you win?
Well, in that case, it was the appellate body. Okay. So it's not a consensus thing. It's more like a court.
Yeah.
But those judges got to the point where they were sometimes anti-American, and therefore we stopped supporting the nominations of judges. So that system is pretty much broken now.
Wow. Okay. And there's no mechanism for us to change that?
Not really. I mean, that's what we've got to figure out. Is how to get the countries together and
do we fund the WTO in any way what leverage do we have over it?
We've got some significant leverage just because of the size of our economy and our trade. But it's not easy. It's not easy. But anyway, that was one of my accomplishments that I'm proud of. The Central American Free Trade Agreement was the first thing that I got passed, which I believe in. I think it helps those countries in the region. As bad as they are right now, they'd be even worse if they didn't have some of these market reforms when, again, required for them to join with us and knock down a lot of barriers to our exports to those countries. So you think of Costa Rica being a successful, country. That's in part because of our trade agreement. Other countries aren't doing as well. A lot of violence, a lot of
everything.
Government scandals,
scandals, cartels.
Yeah,
you name it.
Yeah.
I know you've got to go, so I appreciate it.
Dan, great to be with you.
Yeah.
Again, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here, and you're a thoughtful guy, and you're asking all the right questions.
Appreciate it. Well, that's why I do this podcast, so I can learn from people who know things.
Sorry, I didn't have the right answers, but you had the right questions.
Yeah, I think you got some. What are you doing now? What's in retirement?
Well, I'm on a couple boards, Procter & Gamble companies in Cincinnati. I'm on that board. Also Bechtel, which is a international engineering construction firm. I'm excited about what they do. And then I started the Portman Center for Policy Solutions at the University of Cincinnati, focused on how do you find common ground and solve policy issues. Kind of a simple project, but one that's lacking right now.
Yeah.
Think of immigration and the border as an example. For 30 years, we've been throwing out the right and talking about it. And the right and the left both probably like the status quo politically, but we got to solve it. So how do you solve issues?
Yeah.
And I'm at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right, maybe right-leaning think tank here in town. And I've got an office there, which I've enjoyed. They got a lot of scholars there that get involved in issues like trade.
And busy, but without all the stress.
Yeah. And a few little family companies back home. We have a restaurant back home, and I love that. And I've got a little farm.
Great.
It's busy.
Congratulations on that. Senator, thanks for joining us.
You bet.
This is wonderful. Appreciate it.
Take care.